permanent nation state. Let's speak to Turkish journalist Amberin Zaman, who is the chief correspondent for the news website Al Monitor. She's well versed in the region, especially when it comes to Kurdish matters. Amberin, thank you very much for joining us here. Where do the Iranian Kurds sit when it comes to opposition to the Iranian regime?
Well, they have a long history of struggle against the Iranian regime, and in fact, right after the revolution in Iran, they managed to capture large swathes of territory in their strongholds in western Iran, only to be crushed later on once the clerical regime had consolidated. And they have been actually largely weakened over the past decades. They were supported by Saddam Hussein against the Iranian government for a while, but then the war finished. And so they were largely relegated to their bases inside Iraqi Kurdistan, the Kurdish region of Iraq, and have been dormant basically for decades. And they're actually also quite fractious. So it is going to be very challenging for these groups to get together, even though they have announced this alliance. And as one of them put it to me, one of the senior leaders of one of these parties, it's more likely that we'll start fighting each other once we cross the border than fighting the regime.
We've heard that President Trump has made those words of encouragement, but in the past, the US has turned its back on the Kurds. So how likely are the Kurds going to want to work with the United States, and to what end?
Well, it's a double-edged sword, because it's the first time that the United States, the world's #1 superpower, has offered them any help in advancing their goals. They say they don't want a separate state, but they do want to have a federal structure inside a democratic Iran. It remains to be seen what the precise nature of this support would be. We know that they've asked the Americans for a no-fly zone that would mirror what the Iraqi Kurds had during the Gulf War. But what I've heard is that so far the Americans haven't committed to that. And there's, as you said, always the risk that they'll be abandoned. But that said, you know, they're willing to face that risk, take that risk, because what's the alternative?
But there may be elements of the proscribed group, Kurdish group, the PKK, involved. The United States, the UK, the EU regard them as a terrorist organisation. So how do they fit in?
Well, that's an excellent question. And of all those groups, they are in fact the best organised. And they are, as you said, linked to the PKK. And in fact, they've been in combat together. You know, they kind of switch uniforms. And their bases are adjacent to one another in the mountains separating Iraq from Iran. And they are, as you said, a proscribed group. And Turkey already was deeply infuriated by the alliance that was struck between the United States and the Syrian arm of the PKK in Syria to fight the Islamic State. And that really sent Turkish-US relations into a just tailspin. So it's quite likely that if indeed the US then proceeds to train the Iranian arm of this group, things are going to not look too great between Turkey and the United States. Turkey, as you know, is a critical NATO ally.
You've said that the Kurdish forces are somewhat diminished. They're not particularly well resourced. So how much of a threat to the Iranian regime would they truly be?
Well, it very much depends on the nature of the support they receive from the United States. In Iraq, when they were setting out to topple Saddam Hussein, you had a US occupation force. You had a very different kind of political landscape also, because the Kurds of Iraq were allied with the largest group in Iraq, the Shia, who had been marginalized for decades by Saddam Hussein, and also with some Sunnis. So you really had a very broad tent bringing together all these disparate opposition groups, whereas in Iran, the Kurds teaming up with Israel and the United States really looks like them fomenting separatism, sort of really breaking up Iran. And that is likely to trigger a very strong nationalist backlash against the rest of Iranians. But I think part of the rationale in this endeavor is the hope that by getting the Kurds to move, they can somehow mobilize the Baloch on Pakistan, on the Iranian-Pakistani border, because they too are a very restive population, hugely oppressed by the Iranian regime. And at the same time, you have a large ethnic Azeri minority. So perhaps the thinking in the administration is that if you could mobilize all these ethnic groups, that would, really challenge the regime, make their lives even more difficult, stretch their forces, and accelerate their fall.
Amberin Zaman, Chief Correspondent with the news website Al Monitor, thank you very much.